is Rabbi Jarrod Grover. I'm the rabbi of Beth Tikvah Synagogue. Today's program is co-sponsored by my congregation, by Adath Israel congregation, and by Beth Sholom. Together, we're pleased to bring you this conversation between myself, Rabbi Cutler from Adath Israel, and Yaakov Katz, who is the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. The format of the conversation today will be a little bit informal. Rabbi Cutler and I will go back and forth with Yaakov, focusing, of course, on what's currently going on in Israel. And if you'd like to ask some questions of your own, you'll find in the chat box an opportunity to type some questions. And Rabbi Cutler is going to be reviewing the questions from time to time. And if there's something really interesting or provocative, he might read from the questions list. We have an hour with Yaakov, so I know we want to make the most of our time together. Yaakov Katz is the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He's the author of Shadow Strike, Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power. He's also the co-author of Weapon Wizards, How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower, and Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War. His books have been published in a number of languages, including English, Hebrew, Czech, Polish, Japanese, and Mandarin. Yaakov served for close to a decade as the paper's military reporter and defense analyst, and was a lecturer at Harvard, where he taught an advanced course in journalism. He also served as Israel correspondent for Jane's Defense Weekly. Prior to taking up the role of editor-in-chief, Yaakov served for 2 years as a senior policy advisor to Naftali Bennett during his tenure as Israel's Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. In 2013, Yaakov was one of 12 international fellows to spend a year at the Nyman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. He is originally from Chicago. He has a law degree from Bar Ilan University, and he lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Chaya, and their 4 children. Welcome, Yaakov. It's great to be with you. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Rabbi Cutler, who will begin with the first question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Grover, and also thank you to Yaakov for joining us. When we started putting this program together a couple months ago, we had no idea what to expect. And as it turns out, today is a really important day in Israeli history. I hope you get us started by just situating us literally in your office. What have you seen from your office window in the last 24 hours? And what have you seen on the streets in the last couple of weeks?
Well, it's great to be with both of you and to be with the entire Beth Tikvah Synagogue and some of the other synagogues that are joining us. This is a important time, I think, in the history and the story of the state of Israel, and also in just the trajectory of the Jewish people and what's happening here in Israel and the challenges that we are facing as a people on the streets and how they affect not just us here in Israel, but around the world, the entire Jewish people. So what's happened here, I thank God I haven't been in my office for the last 24 hours. I do get to go home every once in a while still. But just a couple hours ago, outside my window right over here, this is Jaffa Road, Rehov Yaffo, which is basically the main road at the entrance to Jerusalem. We're situated, for people who are familiar with the central bus station, we're just about a stone's throw away from there. And there was a huge protest that kind of made its way down Yaffo Road, flags, drums, blocking the light rail, blocking traffic. Traffic here has been a disaster. I made the mistake of leaving the city in the morning. I thought I'd make it back before the protest. I did make it back before the protest, but the roads were already completely blocked. I was able to get, about a 20-minute walk from my office. I ditched my car. I hope it hasn't been towed, and I didn't get too high a ticket, but I'm not too hopeful. I'll see if I'll be able to find it later tonight. And I can even show you, I showed you guys the
Yaakov, I think we lost your audio.
There you go. My mother and her husband landed from New York earlier today, just about an hour ago, and they couldn't get, for a couple hours, they couldn't leave the airport. And as many of you have read, there are protests now at the airport. It's part of the strike, the nationwide strike. So they were able to finally get on a train that dropped them off at the train station, which is right near here. But they weren't, how are they going to get their suitcases home? So my mother dropped them off here, and I told her, I'll hopefully get them to you at some point today, tomorrow, the next day, when roads once again are open and we can move around in the city.
Thank you. What has been sort of the most exciting part of covering this as a newspaper?
I mean, I think we have to zoom out for a moment and look at it from the wider context. This is not something that just happened 12 weeks ago when the Netanyahu government was formed, right? There were the elections on November 1st. Netanyahu built his coalition, and they came into office pretty much on December 29th. That was the swearing in of the coalition. January 4th, Yariv Levin, the justice minister, who's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, unveiled or rolled out the judicial reforms and basically outlined the 3 pieces of legislation that would be the anchor for the change that the coalition wanted to institute into the balance of power in Israel. January 7th, 3 days later, was the first protest. If you remember, it took place at the Habima Square, so just outside a theater in downtown Tel Aviv, and it was a rainy night, so the trademark of that protest was that all these people holding umbrellas, and it was quite impressive to see 20,000 or so people out in the rain, despite the bad weather, taking to the streets to protest what they saw as a turn away from being a liberal democracy. But why do I mention that is because the November 1st election was our 5th election in 3.5 years. So I think I look at this as an extension or as a continuation of this political paralysis that has overtaken Israel over the last 4 years or so, and has led us from one election to the next, has really gotten this country caught up in a state of constant mudslinging, of me telling someone else that their guy's wrong, my guy's right, vice versa. Imagine for a moment that every Shabbat meal, every Chag meal, every Seder meal, as we're about to all celebrate next week, please God, is marked by conversations and debates and discussions about these issues. So I look at it kind of in the wider context of how this didn't just pop out of nowhere. Israel is still stuck in the mud, right? And we have yet to really emerge from it. So what this has done is it compounded all of that. We at the newspaper have been doing our best to cover this political nightmare, for lack of a better word, that has overtaken Israel over the last few years. But I think that it's an exciting time. I mean, there's no doubt, it's exciting, it's riveting, it's action, it grabs you, it takes over your life. And I think a lot of us feel very engaged, but very connected, and on a visceral level, it's very much part of us. I think, by the way, you see that across the board for Israelis, right? When you have 300,000 people who are taking to the streets on a weekly basis, that's about 2.5% of our population. Canada's population is about 40 million people, right? So, I mean, imagine for a moment that you have 1 million people, right, who every week for 12 weeks straight are coming out and protesting in Toronto, in Montreal, in other cities, Ottawa, across the country, right? It's unheard of. I think it's unimaginable to certain countries. In the United States, to think of 8 million people, right? It's crazy, but that's what's been happening here in Israel, and that's because of this deep sense of anguish and distress that so many people feel here.
Yaakov, early on, you said that the protests were about a feeling that the country was moving away from democracy. Can you help us understand why? I mean, we see this as an election that took place fairly. Why, why do people feel like Bibi's election put the democratic character of the state into question?
So what I said was, first of all, I think that it's a potential move away from being a liberal democracy, right? I personally, people who have called and said throughout this process that Israel will stop being a democracy. I disagree with that. I think that we will, as long as we still have the right to vote, which I hope we still will have at the end of all of this, we will still be a democracy. We might not be a liberal democracy. We will become an authoritarian democracy. And I'll be happy to explain why. The reason is because, like in your system or other systems that we know in the Western and democratic world, we have 3 branches of government. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The unique characteristic, though, of the state of Israel, which is, by the way, not very different from Canada to some extent, is that with the parliamentarian system, so when there are elections in the Knesset and a prime minister is selected and forms his or her coalition, automatically there's no daylight between the executive branch and the legislative branch, because the executive branch is pulled from the coalition itself. So basically, whoever is prime minister controls both the executive branch, the government, the cabinet, and the Knesset through their majority coalition. Until now, what that has meant is that the one branch of government that can actually balance the other 2 out and provide oversight and accountability and preserve human rights and civil rights has been the court. Now, personally, I believe that the court has exaggerated some of its powers, has gone maybe a bit too far with some of its decisions, and taking over to itself in the interpretation of certain laws that gave it certain authorities and the ability to enter into different jurisdictions, and the question of legal standing. There's a lot that we could talk about, but and I'll just say one other thing. It also makes sense that there should be reforms, right? I think the way we select our Supreme Court justices for a long time has not been right. I think there's a problem when judges are part of the process that select other judges. However, when they outlined or rolled out their judicial legislation, what they spoke about were 3 pieces of law, primarily. The first was the change to the Judicial Appointments Committee. And they basically wanted to say that they will have the exclusive majority and they will not need to work with anyone else on the committee. So coalition now will be able to select who the judges are. So Netanyahu tomorrow, theoretically, could decide that his personal lawyer in his corruption trial that's ongoing for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust will become the next president of the Supreme Court. Right? I mean, he could decide that I'll be the next president of the Supreme Court. That won't happen because he reads what I write. So unlikely for that. So that's one. Now we could say maybe we could live just with that. But then there's the second piece of legislation, the override bill, which, by the way, they often mention Canada when we talk about the override bill. And the override bill would give the Knesset the right to re-legislate laws that have been struck down by the court. Now that alone, you could also say maybe I could live with. But then there's the third bill. And the third bill that they want to legislate is a law that will basically allow them to legislate laws that they can make them immune from even the court's review. They would basically declare any law basic law. And because we don't have a constitution, we just have a group of basic laws that have been made into something of a constitution by the court. And they could decide this is a basic law and the court can't even touch it. So each on their own, you could say, okay, maybe I could somehow survive. But the moment you have all 3, you are erasing any potential for checks and balances or oversight by the court. The coalition now will stack the court with its people. The coalition will be able to overturn court decisions, and the coalition will be able to pass legislation that could potentially undermine civil rights and human rights in the country. And the court won't be able to touch them. And by the way, just to add to the craziness of it all, when asked by the press, I remember at a press conference, what ensures that civil rights or human rights will be protected, Bezalel Smotrich and Simcha Rotman, Smotrich being the finance minister, Rotman, a member of his party, the Religious Zionist Party, is the chairman of the Constitution and Law Committee who's been pushing this through the Knesset, said, oh no, trust us. Now, with all due respect to those 2 men, I don't think we can trust anyone, right? This isn't about trust. This is about having laws and checks and balances that protect human rights. Now, that's what's at stake here. So now you could have asked me, Rabbi
You-
Grover.
It was in your view, the judicial reform was necessary, but what the government proposed was too extreme.
In my view, judicial reform is still necessary. In my view, though, what the government did was they went too far. They went too far to take too much of those of that authority to themselves. And I'll add just one other dimension to it. When you want to make significant changes to the balance of power in your government, because these are significant changes, no doubt, then you would think, right, I want to work with both sides of the aisle because I want this to last. I want this to stay in the next Knesset and for future governments and to change Israel for years and decades to come. So wouldn't you want to work with the opposition? Because what you're doing by doing it unilaterally is you're passing laws. Now, I don't know that Netanyahu will be prime minister forever, right? He might think he will be, but we all have an expiration date, and eventually he won't be prime minister, and you could get Yair Lapid or somebody else. So what will they do? They'll just overturn the laws. So what was the purpose? So the pendulum will just swing back. Why not? If you're really looking to do it genuinely, because you care about the state of Israel, because you want to change the state of Israel, make it better, then do it with the opposition. And that, I think, is just the perfect evidence or proof that this isn't about making Israel a better country. This isn't about strengthening democracy. This is about personal interests. And that's what's been the real motivation behind this, unfortunately, since the beginning.
I'm glad you brought up Bibi speaking the language of this is the Canada law. The reference being to the notwithstanding clause in the Canada Act, which allows under certain conditions for governments to pass legislation that they knowingly and openly say contravenes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canadian legal scholars have spoken out with respect to what Bibi is saying, most notably Erwin Cutler, a name known to, I believe, probably to everyone who's on this webinar, saying that Bibi's, he's inaccurate, it's disingenuous, that in fact this is not the same thing as a notwithstanding clause. Has Bibi in any way, it's a very Canada question, has he recently stepped back from this language, or is he just happy to say it's just like Canada?
By the way, Erwin Cutler, who I'm proud to be able to call a friend, I saw him on Motzei Shabbat on Saturday night at the protest outside the president's residence. He was there. I'm walking by. I had yet to be to a protest, and I felt, as a journalist, I feel that it's not, we should not be going to protests, but I did want to see what it was. And so I went for the first time, and Erwin was there. I said to Erwin, does your wife know that you're here? His wife, for those who might be, who don't know, was the assistant to Menachem Begin back in the day, the leader of the Likud. She tends to take a more right wing approach to things. But Erwin was there and fighting for also Israel's democracy. Netanyahu and other members of his coalition have often touted the Canadian system and the so-called override bill that you have as an example of, no one says that Canada is not a democracy. They've also spoken about the way Canada selects its Supreme Court justices, right? Mostly from, yes, I have a law degree, never practiced, did too much with it. But if I understand correctly, if I remember correctly, Canada, the way it stands, basically the justice minister recommends to the prime minister to
Part of the problem is it's a little background. It's a moving target. That is to say that de jure, it is basically an appointment of the prime minister through the governor and council. But in practice, starting as back as Paul Martin as prime minister in around 2006, there was some level of greater input from the legislature and the legal world more generally.
But Rabbi Cutler, it's just input. At the end, it is the decision of the prime minister. Correct. So it was often touted as an example of political people, right, politicians making these decisions. By the way, America in the same, the United States in the same way of, the president nominating and going to the Senate. Now, they do this because most people don't bother to look at Why did Canada pass an override bill? What was the background? What was the history? What was that debate that was back in the day about the Constitution and Quebec's request that, it be able to retain its unique character, the culture and the norms of democracies that Canada might have, and New Zealand is another example that they often talk about, that these countries have, which also have constitutions that Israel does not have. So you could say, oh yeah, in Canada it's the prime minister, or in the United States it's the president. But in the US, you then have the Senate confirmation. And in the US, you have a very strong constitution, and you have a way that things are just not done. In Israel, we don't have that. And the reason we don't have a constitution is because it's never been possible for Israel to write, draft, and pass a constitution because of the different interest groups, because of how really divided this country is to a large extent, even before everything that's going on now.
I want
Yaakov,
to circle back to a moment. Oh, sir, go ahead if you have a follow-up.
Yeah, Yaakov, you said something about Bibi being extreme in the way he presented these reforms. You're looking at the country now in total chaos and disarray. Do you have any words for the left and their extremism and how they've handled opposing the judicial reforms?
And if my question dovetails well there, I want to quote to you something that the Jerusalem Post put in the paper from what Ben-Gvir released recently. He said, the votes of the pilots are worth more than the Golani and the border police. The votes from Tzahala, which is a North Tel Aviv, a wealthy suburb, are worth more than the votes from Dimona and Beersheba, and the votes of high-tech workers are worth more than manual laborers. You mentioned sustained protests of 2.3% of the population being very high. It is in terms of sustained protests, but ultimately 2.3% of the population is under the minimum threshold to get a single Knesset seat. So dovetailing on what Rabbi Grover asked, is there an imbalance in their response, both in terms of what's been done, setting fires on the Ayalon Highway, and are we talking about ultimately, an urban wealthy elite versus, more peripheral individual citizens of Israel?
So, I'll try to answer both, but let me just say to Rabbi Grover's question, yes, I think that the opposition could have done things differently. I think that the opposition, when in the beginning of this process, when Yair Lapid, the former prime minister, foreign minister, and now opposition leader, said, we're willing to engage in dialogue, but only if you suspend or freeze legislation for 60 days, that was that was wrong. It was not realistic. And it was exaggerated. I mean, there was an election that was held in Israel. And in this election, Netanyahu won, and he formed a coalition. And his coalition has every right to pass legislation and to carry out what their stated platform was during the election campaign. And by the way, it's not as if they hid that they wanted to they didn't make a secret of their desire to pass judicial reforms. They've said all along that this is something they want to do. So it wasn't a surprise. And I think that Lapid could have done better. I think he could have made more of an effort to reach out to the coalition. And there were different periods that the coalition said, we're open to dialogue. Let's go to the president's residence. Let's meet now. And again, Lapid said, well, only if you freeze all the legislation. At one point, we wrote an editorial that said that Lapid was drunk on the success of the protest. His people called me up and said, Lapid's not drunk. How dare you write something like that? And I said, well, first of all, it's a phrase in English, so, relax. But secondly, yeah, he was enjoying, I think the protests have served him politically well, because had there not been the protest, he would not be able to defeat Netanyahu if there were to be a new election. Now you look at polls, he's soared. And there's a real chance that if elections were to be held tomorrow or sometime soon, he could have a real chance of forming the next government and defeating Netanyahu. So the protests have also served his political agenda. I think that's, by the way, that's the problem. The problem is that we've had two politicians who are very much focused on their political agendas. And while I think that they both care deeply for the country and there are patriots on both sides, I think that to an extent, they are putting somewhat their personal agendas also in the mix. As rabbis, you I'm sure were in synagogue and read Parshat Ki Tisa just a couple weeks ago, right? Where the story of the Egel HaZahav, right? The golden calf. And then God tells Moshe, we were going to kill all the people. And Moshe, there was this one, I remember reading it in the middle of all of this, and this one pasuk, this one verse grabbed me where he says, Moshe says to God, forgive everyone, but if not, mecheni na misifrecha asher katavta, right? Erase my name from the books that you've written. And I thought about that as we're going through what we're going through. And I said, wow, this is, what a leader. Because what was Moshe basically saying? It's not about me, it's about the people. And if the people aren't there, I don't want to be there. And we don't have leaders like that today, that we have to be honest and say, unfortunately. Now, the issue of, to Rabbi Cutler's question of the different classes, there is a part of this protest, without a doubt, is a shift and a change that is taking place in Israel when it comes to classes, right? There are people in this country, and you go to the protests and you see mostly secular Israelis, mostly Ashkenazi Israelis, although it has to be said there have been protests in Beit She'an, which is a predominant Sephardic community with Likud voters. There have been protests with thousands of people in Beersheva, another city in the south in the Negev that gets a lot of Likud votes. There have been protests in Efrat, a settlement in the Gush Etzion block south of Jerusalem. So you've had diversity of the different locations, but no, I don't think anyone can tell you that it's not predominantly secular, and probably people who, yes, did not vote for Netanyahu, and people who come from Ashkenazi descent. With that said, what I think their concern is, yes, it's about judicial reform. There's probably they're upset that Netanyahu was still prime minister. But I think what's also underlying here is the fear of where Israel's going. They look at this coalition, right wing, far right, very religious, very ultra-Orthodox. And they say, what happened to Israel? Where's the Israel that I knew? And that's also taking them out to the streets. That's also bringing them out. And this is a problem, right? We are more divided than ever. And that's why I said in the beginning, it's not just about this. There's something deeper here.
And some have asserted that the Supreme Court is all that side has left because they don't have the demographics. And that's where their resistance towards any reformation to the Supreme Court really comes from, is if they don't have the Supreme Court anymore, they've got no political power at all, and the character of the country is likely to change.
So I disagree with that for the simple reason that if you look at the votes and the way and the numbers in the last election in November, it was almost 50-50. 50% that voted for the parties in this coalition and 50% that voted for parties that are in the opposition. Now you could say, okay, but 1 second, some of those are Arab votes, true. But there were also hundreds of thousands of votes that went to waste because Meretz did not cross the threshold. The country is divided. The country is, there are those who are voting for those right-wing parties, Likud, the Jewish Power Party of Ben Gvir, the Religious Zionist Party of Smotrich, Shas of Aryeh Deri, United Torah Judaism of Yitzchak Goldknopf. Those are, there is a significant percentage of this country that, yes, is right-wing. There's a significant percentage of this country that still voted for Lapid and Gantz and Yisrael Beitenu of Lieberman and and Meretz and Labor and the Arab parties. So it's not clear-cut in that way, number one. Number two is the court has made critical mistakes, which we can't ignore, right? I look at the Supreme Court, 75 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, in 2023, does it make sense that in a country where half of the people are Ashkenazi and half of the people are Sephardim, that you have one Supreme Court justice who is of Sephardic descent? Does it make sense that in 75 years as a country, out of 72 or 73 Supreme Court justices, only 11 are of Sephardic descent? Come on, we can do better, and the court can do better and can be more representative, without a doubt in my mind, but not like this. This, in my view, this is not the way to do it. Right. The way to do it is to do it with consensus. The way to do it is, and by the way, they all agree. That's what it is. They all believe that the court needs to be more diverse. They agree that reforms are needed. They agree that the Knesset should have an override bill, but not with a simple majority, with a special majority, right? All of these reforms make sense. All of these reforms have the potential to strengthen Israel's democratic character and our democracy, but just not this way, in a way that you're steamrolling over and trampling the rights. Now, there is anguish on both sides. There's distress on both sides. You know, those first pilots from the 69th Squadron of the Air Force that said, we don't feel that we can continue to serve in reserves. I know these guys. These were the people who I wrote a book about them. These were the men who on September 5th, 2007, were told by their commander in the afternoon, after the cabinet had voted here in Jerusalem to attack a nuclear reactor being built in northeastern Syria, that they need to board their cockpits in a few hours just after midnight and fly off to Syria in a mission that defies imagination and destroy a threat of potential existential nature. And they did not hesitate for a second. And what were these men called? And these men, these airmen, these pilots, these navigators, what were they called? One minister in the Israeli government said they're cowards. Another minister in the Israeli government said that they're narcissists. A mouthpiece for Netanyahu in one of the media groups said that they are pus that need to be removed from Israel. Are we for real? Have we lost our minds? These are heroes. And this is how we're talking about one another. This just there is a problem that has taken over here. We have ruptured as a nation. As bad, as terrible as that sounds. Now, I could give you the silver lining if you'd like, but I think that this is a very bad moment for the state of Israel.
Is your feeling that communities like ours in the diaspora, should we be taking a side? Should we have an opinion? Should we be public about our desire either to ask Netanyahu to withhold the legislation or to march forward? Or do we say this is an internal Israeli dispute and we hope that in the end everything will be resolved civilly with as little violence? But in the diaspora, it is not our role to pick sides. Tell me what your thoughts are about that.
Look, I can't tell you what to do, but I do think that you have a right to voice an opinion and to express that opinion. This is my personal belief. Not every Israeli will agree with what I'm about to say, but I believe that the state of Israel is not just the state for the people who live here. The state of Israel plays a role in lives of Jews around the world. That is our raison d'etre.
That's an easy answer for an individual Jew. I'm asking about a community. I'm talking about we've been having a very active debate here about whether our federation should be taking a position in this debate. What are your thoughts? You speak primarily, I'm guessing, to an international Jewish audience.
I'm saying, I believe, and I've written this, that I believe that because of the unique character of the state of Israel and the role that we play in the lives of Jews around the world, and because of the importance of this connection, of the sense of peoplehood that we, the Jews of Israel, have with the Jews of the world in Canada, in the US, and around the world, that we rely on you and you rely on us, that we need to hear from our fellow Jews what the consequences are of what we are doing. And it doesn't mean that we will change the direction. It doesn't mean that Israel has to listen to what you have to say, that we should stop or move forward or pause or change. But I do think that if there are to be consequences, if this is a move that will make people in the community feel that the Israel that they care for, the Israel that they pray for, the Israel that they yearn for is one that is changing its direction, and it will create this divide, that we should know that. And we shouldn't wake up tomorrow and find out that, the UJA or in case it's the UJA in Toronto or is stopping delegations to the state of Israel because of what's happened, and then there will be an easy way to write that off. They're all progressive, liberal, leftist, Israel haters. No, that's not true. And we should know ahead of time that there might be a price, and that's fine. We can calculate as a country and decide that that's a price we want to pay, but we should be aware of the impact that this has.
Thank you. You spoke earlier about some of the challenges or concerns about specific pieces of legislation being open for opportunities for individual advancement. So appointing your personal lawyer, although interesting, his personal lawyer said he would stop being his personal lawyer if this passed,
Right.
his personal lawyer to appoint him to the Supreme Court. And you may recall Bush Jr. did try to do that with Harriet Miers, his own personal lawyer, but because it wasn't an executive decision ultimately, it was pushed back and she was not ultimately confirmed. So concerns for Supreme Court appointments, concerns about the dairy law, right? It's legislation so that someone who had been earlier said cannot be in cabinet can now be in cabinet, and now concerns about a National Guard being established under the purview of Ben-Gvir, which will keep the coalition together, provided this legislation doesn't go ahead, and it seems as if it's not, at least for the time being. What are the worries in terms of a democracy when there are exceptions or legislation that are made specifically for one individual?
I mean, this is part of what we're dealing with, right? My belief is that if you would look back 10 years ago, I could show you videos of Netanyahu speaking about the Supreme Court of Israel as the most important institution, one that needs to be protected, that he will never touch and will never allow to be changed. These ideas for legislation have come up in the past. They're not new from the last few months. People have tried to get Netanyahu on board, but he refused to. So what did change? His personal circumstances, right? When he is now on trial, and when he's on trial and he goes to bed at night and lies there before he falls asleep, he can't not think about the prospect that he could be convicted and be sentenced to prison. Whatever we think about the trial and the charges being brought against him, it makes no difference. That is the motivation here. When you have a government that has a minister who has been appointed, who is a two-time convicted felon, Aryeh Deri, who was convicted in the early 2000s for bribery, most recently for tax evasion, and he's made health minister and interior minister. That is, in my view, outrageous and an embarrassment and a stain on Israel. On the other hand, I will just say, by the way, the flip side is that when 400,000 people voted for Aryeh Deri, and he was confirmed as a minister by 64 members of the Knesset, and then just 10 Supreme Court justices say, well, it's unreasonable for him to be a minister in the government, that is a slap in the face of the 400,000 people who voted for him. So what's more reasonable, what those 10 people said on the bench, or what 400,000 people when they slipped their ballot into the ballot box? We might have to live with that, but that's some of this is the rules of the game. Some of this is how it's played. Some of this we can live with. I think we have to make a distinction, Rabbi Cutler, between some of those laws that have to do with, let's say, the dairy law and some of this other political maneuvers that are done. For example, what Netanyahu is now giving Ben-Gvir, this private National Guard that will fall under his jurisdiction. I can live with that. We've been, we've seen very controversial legislation be pushed through in the past. Don't forget the Oslo Accords were pushed through by Yitzhak Rabin in a government that relied on two members of Knesset who were bought off at the time by Volvos, right? They were made ministers and they got Volvo cars. That was the cars at the time that ministers got back in the 1990s. And we saw the disengagement from Gaza in 2005 and the way Ariel Sharon, who was then prime minister, bulldozed that through, right? Brought it to a vote of the Likud party, of all Likud members. And then when they said no, he said, I don't care. I'm still pushing it through. There are some things that is the way this is done. The scope of the reforms as they stand is something different, because this really has the potential to alter the basic character and the foundations of what Israel's democracy means.
What about the role of Rabbi Grover?
No. Rabbi Cutler, I interrupted you last time. You take this one, I'll take the next.
What is the responsibility and the role of the English language media in particular here? Jerusalem Post is certainly read by Israeli citizens residing in Israel. but is read by English speakers around the world. How do you see the role of the English media, coverage in general, and of course, the current situation specifically?
Look, I look at our role as twofold. On the one hand, we're a daily newspaper in the state of Israel, and we write for Israeli citizens who live here. On the other hand, I can't ignore the fact, and I'm proud of the fact, that we receive millions of readers who come from all over the world. Primarily, about 80% come from North America, come from your community, come from people in Toronto and all across the US, and of course, Canada. So we are also reporting to them. We have a responsibility, first and foremost, I believe, to the state of Israel, to the values of the state of Israel, and to the values that guide us as journalists who believe in serving as a watchdog for democracy, holding our government accountable, protecting the country from the different threats that it faces, and keeping this Zionist Jewish state, the Zionist dream alive, and this Jewish state strong and with vitality. With that said, some people might say, well, you shouldn't write negative stories because that will make Israel look bad in the world. I disagree. That is our role. Our role is not to make Israel look bad per se, but our role is to shine a light on what happens in this country and to give people the information and to let them make educated decisions about how they want to engage with the state of Israel. So I think that, yes, we have this maybe added responsibility to an extent, or burden, because we are the go-to news platform for many people who are outside of Israel, who don't know the issues, who could read something and think something that might not be with all the context that they need to understand the tough issue that they're dealing with. But we believe strongly in the country, in our identity as Jews in the state of Israel, or as Israelis, because not everyone here who works is a Jew. And we have Arabs on staff, and we believe strongly in keeping Israeli democracy strong and alive.
Thank you.
I was in Israel, just before I ask you this question, Yaakov, I was in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and we were speaking to a senior member of the Israeli government. And someone asked the question, what newspaper should we read living in the diaspora to get as accurate a portrayal as possible of what's actually happening on the ground? And the answer was, read the Jerusalem Post. So I know you've been at the helm for, you said 8 years, and that you recently announced you're stepping down. But
yes,
the message that I received, and the message I hear from many of your readers, is how much you brought to the paper during your tenure, how you've increased its readership and respectability. So congratulations, and we wish you the best in your future.
Thank you very much.
And stay with the paper. Leaving that aside, I want to go back to the protests. One of the things that I'm proud to say to people when they ask me about the situation in Israel, and they show me videos and pictures of what's going on the streets, is what a sign this all is of a thriving and wonderful democracy. If you tried to have protests like that in many other countries in the Middle East, they would be hosed down in hours. On the other hand, so now I'm looking at what's developing in the past couple of days, and the protests have become almost like a big party on the streets of the Ayalon. It seems to me they've gotten completely out of hand. And now, you said Bibi is going to speak any minute, but the news is already out that the legislation is going to be delayed. Do you worry that what's been set into motion here is a pattern? Just go to the streets and cause chaos, and you'll get, in the end, what you want. Where is the victory here? Who has won? Did Netanyahu lose? And what are the repercussions if Netanyahu lost? Is he toast? Is he finished? Do you expect him to resign? Or is there some hope here of mending the fissures that have been revealed in the past couple of days, the very deep fissures that have been revealed over the past few days through these protests?
Netanyahu, I can see, is actually speaking right now on the television in the newsroom just outside there. And he's saying as we speak that he's decided to not give up on the legislation, but to keep it going, but to pause until the summer session to give more time to work on it, which was what was expected. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the protests. I wonder, Rabbi Grover, what this movement, you're right, it has become something of a party. I saw those videos last night of people doing yoga on the Ayalon Highway, right? If you saw those are actually cute. People burning, setting up bonfires. There is that element of it, but there's also that, for so many people to come out day in, day out, does say something. For high-tech companies, my brother works at a high-tech company in Tel Aviv with about 600 employees worth over $1 billion. The CEO today sent out a message to everyone, cancel everything. Here are buses. You all go to Jerusalem to protest. Other high-tech companies did that. There is a strike across the country by the Histadrut, by the labor union.
To clarify, are they forcing their employees to go, or they're giving them the opportunity to get a bus?
They're giving the opportunity. They're giving them the opportunity. The Histadrut has declared a general strike. The airport was shut down.
This is because of the defense minister, right? This is because they were upset about the firing of the defense minister.
The firing of the defense minister of Yoav Gallant, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the, that final kind of element, and they were waiting. But that showed a negligence and a level of irresponsibility that was unimaginable, right? To fire the defense minister just because he dared to say and to call on you to pause the legislation, by the way, which is what he's doing right now, right? Let's remember, that's what he's doing as we speak. So why did you fire the guy? Which, by the way, he has yet to send the official dismissal letter. So maybe this is all going to change. I don't know. Because only once you get the letter from the prime minister does it actually go into effect. So far, all he did was call him yesterday evening and say, I'm going to be firing you. I don't know exactly where we go from here, to be honest, to your question. I wonder myself, is there a new political movement that's coming out of this protest? Are the protests going to stop now that there is a pause? Will the protests say, okay, we can stop, and let's get Lapid and Gantz and other people into the room with Bibi and the other people and let them negotiate? Is that what's going to happen? My hunch is that the protesters will not give up that easily. My feeling is that they will want to continue, and until this legislation is shelved completely, and that's a problem. I agree. In my view, that's a problem. We need to see real dialogue now. And there are proposals that have been put on the table by the president and by other people. Let's see a real dialogue. Let's see if that's possible.
Is that possible with Benjamin Netanyahu sitting as prime minister?
Look, a few weeks ago, had you asked me, would Netanyahu cave to the pressure of these protests? I was not sure. I was not sure that he would give in. I was not sure that the protests would have this lasting power, but they have, and that's impressive. I don't remember which, Rabbi Grover or Rabbi Cutler, one of you, I think it was Rabbi Grover, you mentioned that looking around the region, right, it's unimaginable, the democracy that we have here. You don't see that in Tahrir Square in Cairo, or in Iran, or in Lebanon, or in Syria. But we can do that here. This shows the vibrancy of the Israeli democracy, of the Israeli people. I think there's another silver lining, by the way, in all of this, is that this idea, and we spoke before about the demographic makeup of most of the protesters, is that if there was this thought that the secular Israelis from Tzahala and those other places were post-Zionists, as they've been called, the leftists were disengaging from the Zionist enterprise. I think these people are showing that they're not, that they're re-embracing. They've reclaimed ownership of the Israeli flag, right? That has been the trademark of the protests. Everywhere you look, you see flag after flag after flag. It's beautiful to watch, from the sense of seeing how much people care for this country. And it's not just they care for their civil rights. I think they genuinely care for Israel, because they recognize that Israel is a unique country. We're not like every other country. We are special. We are unique. We have certain special circumstances, right? And I want to hope that is something that we will be able to carry with us. We'll be able to take this and bring it forward in a positive way, I hope.
You say that now, Yaakov, but after how many days of these protests, of your parents dropping off their suitcases in your office, do you go, it's enough? You
Well,
don't have to.
first of all, I'll just say that, optimism is always needed in places like this, because if we succumb just to the pessimism, then it will never be good, right? Because there's always what to look at that's bad, right? I think we also have to look at the bigger arc of history here and the bigger story of the state of Israel. We're a 75-year-old country. We have been embroiled in conflict since inception. In 1948 and 56 and 67 and 73, and the first Lebanon War, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the second Lebanon War, the rounds of violence with Gaza. Terrorism is part of our story forever, and sadly will likely be forever, right? It's not new. It's a story that has always been there. But the reason that we can actually even discuss today judicial appointments and talk about override bills is because today the state of Israel is so strong, is a regional superpower, has military might, has economic power, has energy independence, which we all know how crucial that is in today's complicated world with the Russia-Ukraine war. We have all of that power, which gives us now the ability or the luxury to take a step back and say, oh, how do we appoint Supreme Court justices? Because when you're fighting for survival, when your back is up against the wall, when you don't know if you're going to make it through the day, you don't think about judges. You just want to make it through the day. But we have that opportunity now because we are strong. Because thank God, Baruch Hashem, we're doing well. And despite it all, and it could all go down the drain and it could all turn upside down. And that's what we have to be careful, because the country is so delicate. The situation is so volatile that we have to keep our eye on what really matters. And 75 years is this is our third attempt as a Jew for Jewish sovereignty, for Ribonut, for sovereignty in the state of Israel. The other two previous attempts thousands of years ago did not last that long, right? Just about 70 years, one of them. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind that the United States, for example, fought a civil war after just 90 years of independence. We're trying to figure out our national identity. Are we a Jewish and democratic state? Are we a democratic and Jewish state? How much democracy? How much Judaism? What role does each of that play? That's what's really, I think, at the root of this whole fight that we're seeing being played out on the streets below.
So how hopeful are you?
At the end of the day, I'm hopeful because I really believe that most people really want what's right for Israel. And I think that even if we do change, if some of these laws do pass, I think that most Israelis, most people understand that we're here and we're living in this country because we're doing something that's bigger than just ourselves. You talk to Israelis, they're unique people in the sense of they're the way they engage with you, the way they want to help you, the way they help one another. And yes, we are very divided, but the feeling of service, the fact that children, I have a daughter who's now in the IDF. I have 3 nephews who are serving one more elite combat unit than the other. I look at these kids, and I'm sure members of your community and children have come here as Chayalim Bodidim, as lone soldiers over the years and have served. Those kids who do this, they could get out of the army. They don't have to serve, but they decide to because they want to give to something that's greater than themselves. And I still feel that is in the DNA of Israelis. That is part of who we are, and it's ingrained in our identity. And I want to hope that will prevail. I want to hope that we will not lose sight of the bigger task ahead of us, which is continuing to build the state for the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland. It's a big job. It's not over. It's still ahead of us. And what's happening right now, when we look back, I mean, we've all read books of history. We've all read, we read the Parsha every week. this is good, just going to be like a couple lines in a history book one day. Let's not forget there's a bigger story that's playing out before our eyes. Let's not forget that.
Do you think there's any chance that a constitution actually comes out of all of this?
Halavai, I wish, but no. Israel is let's not forget, you have your secular Israelis, you have your national religious Israelis, you have within your national religious Israelis, you have the Datim Leumim, and you have now this new, you probably heard of Chardalim, right? Charidim Leumim, which like Smotrich and Ben Gvir come from. You have the Haredim, but you have the Litvaks, the Lithuanian Haredim, you have the Hasidim, you have so many different, you have the Arabs, and among the Arabs, there's different Arabs. I don't see how that's possible today. I don't think that that's possible, but I don't know that we need a constitution. We need some clear rules. We need some clear boundaries. We do need clarity, but not something that we don't need a demolition and a destruction of our system. We need to preserve what we have. Make it better.
Rabbi Grover, it's your turn.
This has been wonderful, Yaakov. What can you tell me, just as we wrap up, what can you tell me about what tomorrow is likely to look like? Are the airports going to reopen? Is your brother going back to work? What's your call?
I think it really will depend, what the protesters say, how they react to the prime minister's speech. I'm starting to see some of those responses come in, and they're not overly optimistic. People are, Gantz now, Benny Gantz, the leader of the National Unity Party, is speaking, and he's saying it's better late than never. He's actually praising Netanyahu's speech. But I think that we'll have to wait to see what these people say and whether they go into
Let me rephrase. If you had Yair Lapid's ear right now, what advice? We've got a chance during this hour to learn about you and your hashkafa. What advice would you be giving to Yair Lapid? What message do you think he needs to give right now to the people on the streets?
Go to Netanyahu's office, show up, knock on the door, ask to go in, and start talking. That's what we need. And I also, I think that I have a lot of criticism of Netanyahu. I think that he has put himself before the people. I think that he, because of his personal circumstances, has lost the right set of priorities. With that said, he was elected. He is the prime minister. We have to find a way to work together. This is not sustainable. This is not healthy. The world is watching, and the world sees what we're doing to ourselves. We can't ignore the fact that Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, we have humongous, amazing challenges on the horizon that we will have to deal with. And they're watching us and they're seeing us rip each other apart. And they're saying, this is amazing. We don't have to do anything. Right. They're killing themselves. They're beating themselves. That's the image we want to portray to the world. That's the story we're telling the world today of the uniqueness and the specialness of what Israel and what the Jewish people are. There's something wrong. We have to find that way to come back together. And that sounds nice. I don't know how it's done practically, but I would say to Netanyahu, and to the same thing, drive to Lapid's office and knock on his door. They're both in the Knesset right now. They could it's across, it's a hallway away. We don't have to travel far, right? We don't have to go to China or Ramallah even, or, we don't need Sadat to fly to Israel like he did in 1977. All we got to do is walk across the hallway and talk.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you both
much.
very much. Thank you,
Yaakov.
Rabbi Grover, Rabbi Cutler, and to everyone who was with us. I appreciate it. It was great to be with all of you. And I wish everyone a Chag Sameach. Pesach is the holiday of freedom. Let's hope we have freedom from some of these protests, a little freedom from the craziness of Israel, but also that we continue on the path of what we're supposed to be doing here in Israel.
Thank you so much, Yaakov. Thank you to Beth Tikvah and to Beth Sholom and to my colleagues here at Adath Israel for putting together today's program. If you want to know about recording, yes, this program was recorded and it will be on the Adath Israel YouTube channel just as soon as we can get it up. And I'll make sure that Rabbi Grover and the team at Beth Sholom have that link as well. We did have a lot of questions. I wasn't able to get to all of them. I did bring in some of them in terms of my own questions. One of the things that people want to know about is, and we spoke about this specifically, the role of the diaspora. We started off before Bibi started speaking today, and questioning what that role should be. And I think that remains an open question. And I think we're going to take our cues from our brothers and sisters in Israel in terms of what does unity look like and how we can play a role in that, because I think that's something that at the end of the day, you know, Am Yisrael Chai, and we want to continue that for many, many years to come. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.